All right, so today we move into the third session of our webinar, and our main focus and the subject of today's webinar is how do we effectively find our hip height? Sorry, how can the stance change our positioning, and how can it affect our hip height? Let me see and make sure that we are on the right stance. Okay, so this was where we left off, the full sequence of the deadlift. If you watch the second one, the second series, you will get to learn about how I can manipulate my knees and use knees as the focus to find my center of balance. So after finding out our center of balance and learning and playing around with the knee position to find your leg drive, right, I'm pretty sure that you guys have already felt the difference of the sumo deadlift. You will pretty much feel that, hey, now I can control my center of mass a little bit better. I can drive my force upwards a little bit more. But uh, even with those information, there will still be a little bit of fine-tuning that requires to be done. For example, the stance. So in this context, right, we want to work with the idea that we have already understood how do we create leg drive and also the toe angle. So just moments ago, I was just describing that feeling that you want to get, you want to feel the upward force, so that upward drive. So the upward drive, right, is always facilitated with the understanding of how you should manipulate your knees when you're wedging in, and also the toe angle, which is the foot angle. So once you have understand the toe angle and also the knee behavior, now we are trying to add on to what we can do to help us improve the sumo deadlift itself. So specifically today we are talking about the stance lah. So when we are thinking about all these contexts, right, we try not to think about, oh, if I close up my stance, I will turn my toes out. Of course, those things will happen to try and manage your center of mass intuitively. But how you want to deal with the deadlift whenever you have faced issues, like for example, you went for a long break, 2 weeks, then you come back for sumo deadlift and you don't feel the same groove as you are. You should follow the steps that I've taken. First of all, webinar series one, what is my stack, right? Armpit, blah, 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 blah. I don't want to repeat myself. Then the second one is, of course, my toe and my leg drive. Third one, we should look at the stance. So when we move and try and adjust the stance, we do not try to move our toe angle anymore, because our toe angle is usually relative to how much hip range I have to produce force. If I were to turn my toes out too much, you are already too much internally rotated, and then when you drive, you have no more room for you to power through. If you turn your toes too forward, you're too externally rotated. When you wedge yourself in, your whole foot will spill over, and you cannot even find places for you to drive your foot into the ground. So we already found that sweet spot. So today we effectively want to look for what is my ideal stance. So in the first slide over here, you can easily see the four different torso lean angle, right? So torso lean angle basically means how upright I am lah, right? Okay, so these are the four, and you can't really see the stance, but this is assuming that on the left here, this is assuming that I adopt the widest stance a barbell can allow me to be. So bear in mind, this is an estimation. I'm not doing it under the bar, but the changes of your stance if essentially change your torso lean, and there's a reason why we want to change the torso lean, and you will be about to know why changing stance will help you in your sumo deadlift and what kind of impact it can create when there is different stances. Okay, so to help yourself understand a little bit more, you want to try and create, right now you try to create a pictorial memory of these four pictures, even though the rest of the slide is all about these pictures. But anyway, try and create a pictorial memory of all these pictures. Basically, for the wider stance, with the stack position, I'm the most upright. Okay, with the less wide stance, I have more forward lean. For the mid, relatively similar, but you realize that there are some changes in the knee position and hip height. And last but not least, the narrow stance. So this narrow stance is the one that is almost like a semi-sumo, where your stance is set in a position where your legs are just outside your grip, right? And we know that our grip is always shoulder width. So Different strategies over here will use different and prioritize different muscle groups. I'm not saying that nobody should do the narrow stance. Of course, I'm always biased with regards to the wider stance. I'm someone who believes that everybody can do sumo deadlift as long as they have acquired the right set of skills and knowledge in it. So let's proceed. Okay, so before we start, right, we want to refresh our memory about what do we know about our ideal hip height. So this is also an add-on to our previous few webinar series to help you understand where exactly is my ideal hip height. Because I mentioned before that the ideal hip height should always be hips higher than the knees, right? So, and which the picture in the middle and the picture on the right is relevant, but the picture on the most left is not relevant. Okay, so that's what we know. We also know that ideally we want to stack our armpit with the kneecap and the midfoot. So once we are able to stack these up, right, our hips will be in place. However, if I were to stack myself into this position and I anyhow manipulate my knees, which let's say I did not go through the second episode or second video series, you will be able to bring your knees out a lot if you're someone which is super, super mobile. But at the same time, you will lose your center of mass, lose your engagement from the legs into the hip. And in result of that, your hips will get very close to the bar. Okay, but that one is more towards the relation of how close you are to the bar. But today we are watching more about the hip height. Okay, so if we look at the most left picture, again, we know that you are seated two down. Initially, I wanted to test you guys, hey, can you tell me what's wrong with this picture? But I feel that possibly only the ones who will be more inclined to share is Bernie lah. Because Bernie will always try and support. But anyway, I'll just blast it off because I'm much more comfortable in talking now. So if you see the most left picture, right? In order to compensate, this is not even a compensatory action. This is more about an act where you think that being feeling tension on the hip, feeling tight on the lower body throughout to the extent of discomfort is the right hip height. Okay, so what's happening here, right, is he sits, which is me, I see myself very, very low into the hips, assuming that I'm right at the bottom of the squat. But it is much more different for in aspect of sumo deadlift versus the squat, because in a squat we usually don't adopt such a wide stance. But even if we look into the context of the squat, right, the bar is already, say, assuming right here in the low bar, right, is already on the heels. There's no way you can drive the weight up while maintaining this torso lean, so you will lean forward when you come up. So same thing, what's going to happen here, right? If you are setting yourself so low like that, when you start the pull, your hips will rise up first, almost into, if you're lucky, you will move yourself into this most right picture. Then the weight comes off the floor. If you're unlucky, right, you wedge yourself super aggressively, right, and then you pull, you spend lots of time trying to reorganize your center of mass. You'll go to here, then the weight doesn't come up, then you end up here in the center picture where you are almost gonna stiff leg or RDL the whole sumo movement up. Okay, so if we look at the center picture over here, we will clearly see that this guy has no idea how to do a sumo deadlift, and this guy did not watch the first and second episode of the webinar series. They assume that the sumo deadlift is like almost like a conventional deadlift. There's less engagement of the quads and the leg drive, and there is more shear force from the back to pull the weight up. So if you're pulling from here, right, you're definitely not identifying the right amount of stack and also not thinking about trying to find your leg drive. Okay, so the most ideal position is, of course, on the right side over here, where we can see by visual, we can see that the hips are higher than the knees. Okay, so your hip height, right, will always usually be the same throughout your lifting journey, unless you make extreme measures to, open your hips up and try and get close to your hip. But we are not about wasting that long amount of time, because unless you are like 14, 15 years old, assuming putting myself, put me, for example, I'm already 31 years old. And for example, if I want to be the strongest, I want to be number one for nationally, internationally, etc., etc., I don't have the amount of time, right, to try and train my mobility or whatnot to be super upright, open my hips out, change my hip internal rotation ranges. to, or external rotation ranges to set myself in a most upright position, right? So in most cases, right, throughout your lifting journey, while we are trying to get stronger, while we are trying to see numbers go up, we would try to establish the fact that your strongest hip height usually do not change, okay? So if my hip height never change, right, in instances, only what we can change is, of course, the stance, knowing that our toe angle is already set in stone. So when we change our stances, what changes is the torso lean and the amount of engagement we can get from the leg drive. And having two wide stance can punish us as well in terms of the leg drive. And I will show you in the next few slides. But what I'm about to show you, right, is how do you spot your ideal hip height? So this is a trick that I can share with you guys. I'm just gonna stop share here first. And I'm gonna share another one. Okay, so I have a lot of videos. Just give me a moment. Need to find my video. Okay, it's right here. Okay, so everybody can see myself with, I think this is 260 on the bar. Okay, so if you watch the video closely, which I will slow it down for you guys, right? Okay, is that this is the position where I try to pull the slack. Okay, then when I wedge in, as much as possible, I try to bring my knees to stack under the midfoot. And look what happens when I start the pull. When I start the pull, you can see that the very subtly from here, the hips will rise up a little bit before the weight comes off the floor. Okay, so if I were to bring my hips too low, I will need a lot more time and effort for the hips to rise up until the weight comes off the floor. Okay, so whenever you watch videos, right, you try and spot yourself. Once the plate comes off the floor, which is pretty much about, want to be precise, 1 inch off the floor, the hip height that you see is the ideal hip height that we want. So what's happening here? Even for myself, even for my level of expertise and skill for sumo deadlift, whenever I pull, there will still be an expectancy of the hips coming up a little bit more first. But do take a look and think about how much and the amount of degree that the hip rise up first is very minimal. So this means that I'm actually acquired and move myself into the right hip height position to pull the weight. So what's the rule of thumb over here? As long as when you wedge in and initiate the pull, right, the hip and the knee deviates as little as possible, that's your best case scenario. And to achieve this position, right, to achieve this experience where when you start the pull, the hip rise up just a little bit, you can't expect it to be zero. You can expect it to be zero if the weight is super light. Everybody can control it. But when it's dealing with very much heavier intensities where it is more like okay, I hope that this move well kind of thing, you want that kind of consistency where the hip deviation is very minimal. Then you know that, okay, whatever I've been doing is the right behavior. My torso lean is correct. My knee wedging in is correct. Okay, so Fuad just entered. Okay, all right. So this is how we know that is your ideal hip height. So if you are experiencing instances where you start the pull, you feel, actually I feel okay. But when I start to pull, my hips keep coming up, my torso just starts to go all over the place. That means that you're not acquiring the right hip height yet. And how do I acquire the right hip height? You manage where you angle your knees. You don't want to angle your knees too out. You want to angle your knees a little bit closer, turn forward. Or what you can do is to try and change your stance, which I will continue my slides over here. So let me stop share first. And let me go back into sharing the slides. Okay. So we already know the hip height. We move next. Okay, so let's talk about how does different stances affect my starting position. Okay, as I mentioned, the main difference of it is your torso lean. And not just about the torso lean, it also affects the leg drive. Okay, so this all contributes to a difference in what stance should I adopt. Okay, so for example, if I'm in a much more narrower stance when I initiate the pull, I might not be able to feel the the all the leg drive that I can get. For example, if I'm pulling and I always feel that, hey, up to a certain intensity, right? Most of it is my back takeover or my hamstring and glutes takeover. So if the lift it's very, very hingy, like, oh, I'm trying to create hip extension, then you are not actually trying to perform the right sumo deadlift. It means that the leg drive, in order to hold the leg drive in the narrower stance, you need to turn and crank your knees out a lot to hold your torso lean. Anything more than that, right? And use your leg drive lah. But why do you want to spend so much effort trying to do that? Another next instances that I can think about is when you have such a forward lean torso, right? Like the narrow stance, when you start the pull, right? Whatever it is, the gravity will do its work. Your body will start to roll upwards, try and end up having your center of mass going into the toes. And whenever you pull, you start to feel that you cannot maintain the balance, and that means the stance might be too narrow. Okay, so if you are somewhere in the mid stance or towards the narrow stance, another instance is when you start the pull, right? Your back always rounds. And when your back always rounds, right, it means that the torso angle that you are dealing with right now, right, you're not your lower back, your mid back, your TL junction, thoracic to lumbar area over there, and basically your erectors, right, are not strong enough to hold that torso lean. We are not like John Hack or any strongman over there, which is their erectors are so thick, right? Of course, you can train it up, lah, but again, it is something that you will spend a very, very long time. For example, I will do tons and tons of back extension. I do tons and tons of RDL, good morning, to try and strengthen up my erectors. So when I do that, right, I not only fatigues out my erectors for my next day. For example, when I do my squat, it will be more cooked. Or the next instance is when I go back into doing sumo deadlift, right, my back is so cooked from the erector work that I cannot deal with it properly already. So this kind of strategy only comes in when, for example, we have a long, long time for us to build up. Then we can, okay, let's go back to all this foundational stuff, work all the erectors and all that. But in the sumo deadlift, right, what motivates us to get stronger is when we can see numbers going up, we can see ourselves feeling better and better and better. And that's one of the reasons why we want to play around with our technique. We use our brain and use our knowledge a little bit to improve our technique lah. So if you are in mid-range, which I will show you some videos later about one of my clients, Surly, she used to be in a very mid-range and her back always rounds. So when a back always rounds, right, it increases the chance of his lower back going into over flexion, a flexion that she cannot deal with or he cannot deal with. Then injuries happen all the time. So when injuries happen all the time, there will be more downtime. You cannot squat, you cannot deadlift, then eventually get weaker. Now, when we go into the wider stance, of course, with a wider stance, if we look at anything that starts from here, right, we don't look at the narrow stance, right? If we look at anything that starts from mid-wide to super wide, right, what you are seeing, right, is the slight changes in your torso lean. And you might not see very clearly in the pictures over here. It might not be very accurate because I'm not holding an actual bar. But what changes is as you widen up the stance, right, you can potentially change your torso lean into a more upright position. So if you take into context, right, just now I mentioned, oh, if you have a mid stance guy, you have a higher tendency of your lower back rounding, right? Then we need to think about, hey, why not, right? We widen out our stance a little bit. Or for example, if I keep with this narrow stance, I pull, right, my body rounds, my body go forward, then I know that, okay, let's try and widen up the stance. And look what happens if you widen up the stance correctly, right? Your hip height, right, is the same. See all these three pictures, right? The hip height is the same. So what changes is the torso lean. And when you change the torso lean, it changes your engagement of the legs. Okay, so you will see that what happens is at this starting position, you will feel that there is a stronger engagement of the quad. Assuming the context is you come from a mid stance, you know all your problems. When you're back round, right, you cannot use your legs also, right? So now let me try widen up the stance. And I believe one of my clients, Marcus, he's not in this call now. After he made the change of widening up the stance, which he never believed. And why he never believed is because he wasn't able to apply that knee engagement, because he always say that, hey, when I widen my stance, my hip hurts. Okay, that is because you are trying to crank open your hips through the hips. If you are focusing on opening up the stance out with your knees and focusing on stacking it under the midfoot, you literally can feel minimal hip positioning, unless your hip ranges is so bad. But if you are so bad, right, you'll most likely be just in a narrow stance, and I might as well ask you to go into conventional, right? Okay, so we know that the hip stays the same, and as we move into the wider stance, right, super wide stance, literally your toes touching the plates, which is similar to what I'm doing. What I'm trying to tap into is to exploit the shortest range of motion possible, but there's a consequence if you are not able to stay in this position well. What will happen is if you are here and you drive your stance is too wide, right? You don't have enough of the external rotation to keep you in position. Your knees will buckle in so much that it becomes like this. It becomes like this. Okay? So in today's webinar series, right, I'm not encouraging everyone to widen up their stance to the max, but what I'm thinking and hoping that you guys can go and try about is if I were to open my stance slightly wider, will I be able to feel a little bit more upright, feel minimal hip discomfort, but at the same time, I can get more quad engagement in. Okay? Okay, so next. So you must look clearly out. How does different stance affect my starting position? And how does different stance affect my pull? Okay, so now, right, I can show you with some video depiction of what happens if your stance changes. Okay, so let me just stop share again. I will share screen. One by one we do. Let me see. So, okay, where am I? Okay, this one can close already. Okay, so we are looking at this video. Everyone can see, right? Let me just double check. Can everyone see? Can. All right. All right. Okay. Okay. So if you look at this video over here, this is assuming I adopt the wider stance. So first of all, you can already see that something is messed up on my hips already. If I adopt such a wide stance, right, one hip is higher than the other. So that will be another story for the next time. But what happens is when we have such a wide stance, right, you will feel that you are a little bit more upright. Even no matter how well you try and stack yourself at the starting position, your knees buckle in. If there's a slight deviation or buckling in and you can still maintain good center of mass when you're driving upwards, it's okay. But if your stance go all the way in, your knee cannot hold that position, okay, for the weight to come off, then we know that this stance is a little bit too wide, okay? Another thing is, of course, if you are here and then you force yourself to hold in this knee position as long as you can, and to a certain extent, you will find that, hey, this is not effective at all. If I keep staying here, right, the weight will never come off the floor. Then you know that this is a little bit too wider stance. Okay? So we are all looking at, in the most worst case scenario, what happens, so that you can try and know when you open up this stance, you see this kind of pattern happening, then you know that, okay, I cannot go so wide. Okay? So when I wedge in, okay, if my knees buckle in a little bit, like so, it's okay. But if it continues to buckle in and then the weight comes off the floor, then you know that this stance is not appropriate for you. Okay? Okay. Now we go for the next one. So now we are looking at somewhere in the middle stance. So middle stance is much harder for me to think about what kind of scenarios can be created, but let me try and find. Is this the one? Just give me a sec. No. Yep. So this one. So I will go back to Zoom. Okay. All right. So this is the assuming that I'm in a normal white stance. So assuming that this is my most favorite stance, what's happening is if I'm in that stance where I can wedge in, so what's happening is, let's say if I'm wide enough, but not super wide, when I wedge in, right, there's a high tendency for me to sit too low before the weight comes up. Then you know that this is not the appropriate stance for you as well. Okay, so if I'm seeing this kind of behavior, let's say I wedge in, okay, and then the hips come up first, boop, like that, it means that your whole lower body is not anchored enough. No matter how hard you force and keep your knees in position, right, you are struggling to hold your hip height. Then you pretty much need to adjust your stance a little bit wider so that you can hold your hip position. So what I'm talking about here, right, is if you are able to set yourself in a position, the moment you wedge in, right, you feel that knee, you feel a little bit of that hip locked in position, right? That's the best for you. If you don't want to feel in such a way that there's so much room for your hips to, anyhow move about, uh, if you allow the hips to anyhow move about, right, it means that your positioning of the stance can be a little bit wider. Okay. Then we go into the next one. I think it's right. It should be this one. Yep. Okay. So this is the mid stance and what can possibly happen if you are going into a mid stance lah. So if most people when they try to do a mid stance, right, they are somewhere in the middle where uh if you see yourself, oh, in order to push the weight out upwards, right, I need to crank my knees all the way out like that. So if I were to crank my knees all the way out like that, yeah, Clinton said I I try to stack my knees under the midfoot ma. Yeah, right now I'm able to stack myself into the midfoot, but because your hip you're trying to create hip external rotation in an environment where you're supposed to create internal rotation, right? Wow, that was a very long sentence. If you're trying to do that, right, it means that you're only trying to use your body leverages, which is the cranking of the hip, forcing the hip into maximal external rotation to sort of pop the weight off the floor. And if you are doing that, right, many, many bad things will happen. You'll start to feel that your hip flexors are getting cooked all the time, and you realize that you cannot lock yourself out properly. So you crank your knees out all the way, and then you will lean back a lot because you cannot you cannot create any more knee extension. You are only just using hip extension to lean yourself backwards. So if you see yourself having soft knees during the lockout, right, it means that I'm trying to crank my knees too wide. And why do I need to crank my knees so wide when I can easily just widen up my stance, right? Okay, so next. Okay, last one already. Where are we? Okay, my closest stance not coming up. Oh, it's here. Oh, yeah. Okay, so this is the super narrow stance. And potentially what could go wrong, right, is when you start the pull, your back rounds, your hips go up all the way, and then you're using your back to finish. So this one is very clear cut lah. Very easy one. If you are doing a sumo, right, if your conventional deadlift is already rounding and you feel your back when you pull, and you go into a semi-sumo or sumo deadlift position, whether or not it is a super narrow stance or slightly wider stance, your back always rounds. It's about by time for you to widen up the stance and try to leverage on a more upright torso to drive the weight for you. Okay, so far so good. Okay, so now we go back into the slides. All right. So, um, so these are the possible consequences that I've shown you. Sorry, previously in the videos, I've shown you the possible consequences of what can happen during the movement of the sumo deadlift. And if you are facing all these problems, right, you pretty much needs to look at how do I change my stance to lock myself in so that I have, like I said, the minimal amount of knee buckling in during the pull, the minimal amount of back flexing during the pull. So with the established hip height, why should I change my stance? So this is pretty much the last slide that I have for us to, no, second last slide, okay? So here are a little bit more of a breakdown of what could have happened. And when that happened, you should widen or closen up the stance a little bit, okay? So imagine the center is a spectrum. We talk about the ones on the right side first, okay? If you are in the stance where, let's say if I'm in the narrower stance, my back starts to flex, my lower back took over, I can't really feel the leg drive, and I feel that my whole posterior chain, which is the hamstring, the glutes, are squeezing so hard to finish the movement, then you know that, okay, this stance is definitely too narrow for me because my back is in a vulnerable position for it to round even more. So there's a reason why I don't do conventional deadlift, because I have a high tendency of my back flexing, which is why I convert into a sumo, and I'm never using this because I know that if my torso lean is so acute, right, so much, right, I know that my back will flex. Okay. Next, if I'm here, okay, mid somewhere in the narrower to mid stance level, and in order to compensate for my weak lower back, right, like I said, for example, for me, I never go into convi because of my torso lean. With that high acute torso lean, I cannot feel my leg drive, and my lower back will always round. So what do? I try to widen up the stance. And if I still try to widen up the stance I don't dare to widen up the stance somewhere in the mid stance. When I wedge in, right, in order to compensate and not go into that forward lean position, I must drive my knees out a lot. So if I force my knees out too much, right, to try and maintain the similar hip height, right, I will just effectively be scooping lah. So, and also wedging myself too much into a too externally rotated position for me to even try and create real force production. So there's a two different distinguished understanding about fake, not really like true force production, and just relying on leverages to crank yourself into position, which is why the first webinar is very important to learn about external rotation and internal rotation. We know that internal rotation is everything going inwards, so we want the knee to be able to go inwards, our feet to be able to drive into the floor, so everything is in. So I cannot visualize and cannot get myself into a sumo stance where I have to force my knees out so much to drive the weight. Okay. Now we're moving into the spectrum where we are a little bit too wide already. So if I'm in a stance, right, where, okay, now I'm wider stance, but I still lack the consistency of the hip. Every time I wedge in, is either I sit too low or I sit too high. Then I know that, okay, I might want to find a strategy to make scoop wedging in harder. When I make wedging in harder, I will think about, oh, I widen up my stance, right? Because I widen up my stance, then it will make my wedging in harder. When I wedge then when it's harder, right, you'll limit me from over wedging in, over scooping, or sitting my hips too low. Okay. So in another idea is, let's say you go wide, oh, my hips are too tight, I cannot even wedge myself in. Every time I wedge in, I end up having a very forward torso lean. Then we know that, oh shit, I'm going too wide already. Time to go back in a little bit. Okay. So now, last but not least, how do I know that I'm too damn wide? Is when I start the pull, I have shown you in the previous video, the knee buckling is too hard. So when the knee buckling becomes too extreme, right, you cannot acquire that leg drive. And also you cannot hold your hip position in a way. So everything will start crumbling down. Your body will go into a lot of forward lean, your lower back will start to flex, and you cannot pull the weight up, right? So this is basically what different stances can help you. So all in all, right, what I will always recommend is, can you still feel your leg drive with the change in your stance? Is my hip too loose or too tight? If they are just comfortable, that's perfect. Do I need to forcefully crank my knees out to set myself into a position? If yes, I need to widen up my stance. So I don't need to crank. I just bring my knees forward or bring my knees towards the fourth toe. Good enough. Okay. Uh, the ultimate goal for us is when we wedge ourselves in, right? We can feel that very stacked, very I wouldn't say super explosive, but you know that okay, I'm in that line, I just need to stand myself out. So that is the pop during the initial drive. There are some days where you feel that, oh, when I pull, right, everything is so heavy off the floor. Okay, when you look at heavy off the floor, right, always look at the hip height and uh, make sure that your hip height stays higher on the place where it needs to be at your strongest. Then you play around with your stance. Okay, so I want to also find a stance where it can help me minimize scooping. So one of the biggest issue in sumo deadlift when we wedge, we will talk about wedging in the next few sessions lah, is that I will end up over wedging. If I think about over wedging, which means scooping, it means that either I'm too far away from the bar or I have too much mobility for myself to bring my hips forward and close to the bar. So in order for me to limit myself from being close to the bar, right, or having so much free room for my hips to go about, I have to widen up my stance to lock the hips a little bit, inhibit its range of motion a little bit more. Then I know that whenever I wedge in, I get this slightly tight feeling, I get my quad drive, it can come out. Okay, which is why it correlates to the third point as well. The hips needs to be comfortably tight. So I also need to change my stance into a wider stance, for example, if I want to reduce using my back. If I feel my back all the time, if I feel my back rounding all the time, yeah, I think I need to change my stance a little bit. Focus on the engagement of the knees so that I deviate my attention from trying to open my hips. You don't need to open your hips, you just need to open your knees enough for you to produce force. Last but not least, a strong leg drive, which is correlated to the first point that I have. Okay, so right at this point, anybody missed out what I'm saying? Because I'm gonna take a 2 minute break. I really need to pee. So if y'all got any questions, right, just put down on the chat over here first. When I come back in 1 minute, I will help you answer the questions. Just give me a sec. Okay, is it more than 1 minute? No, let me see. I didn't check the time. Yeah, it's less than 1 minute. So no questions. All right. So just for application, could you suggest some ways to progress widening up to the sumo stance, mobility drills or something? Okay. So I have a similar question from her one as well. Because the question that you have in your head is, hey, if I widen up my stance, right, I don't have the mobility to open. So here's the thing. If I were to set up in such a way that I put a lot of focus on my hips, right, then you will feel that I need a lot of mobility drills to open up my hip. When I widen up my stance, right, I'm not exactly trying to crank my knees out even more. Okay? When I widen up my stance, right, I essentially just want to sit with whatever my hip mobility can allow. So for example, for me, right, if I force my knees out, I will feel very, very uncomfortable. My hip is like in pain, and I cannot even feel my leg drive. Okay, so the focus is not on the knees. But if I were to focus on the knee, so I sit a little bit more, I sit slightly, focus on the knee engagement on top of my midfoot, then I wedge myself in. I will create the necessary hip forward lean to get myself into a wider stance position. Okay, so remember the second session where we feel about the outside foot and the knees. So once we are able to focus on that, you will feel that I'm able to go myself into a lower position without the constraint of hip tension. If I were to set myself up, oh, I'm in a wider stance, means I must knees out even more. You will hit a jam. You definitely feel like shit. Your hip will feel very, very jammed up because you're setting up yourself into this position. But actually, you just need to be in this position. Remember, whatever hip height that you use to be able to establish, right, will always stay the same. The hip will always stay the same. Okay? Closer stance, this is your hip. Wider stance, this is my hip. Just that I can change myself into a little bit more upright position. So you see that subtle change. This is my wider stance position without cranking my knees out. So it's like that. And closer stance position. The hip is the same, just that my torso lean changes. See? Right? So before you consider and give up to think about, hey, I don't have any hip mobility, you can try to think about working the the focus first. Focus on your knees, focus on your toes with the wider stance. You will actually feel that, hey, my hip can hold that wider position. Uh, One of my client, Marcus, actually did that. I can show you a video. So I need to see which one this is. Let me see. So if I'm not wrong, this is his closer stance behavior. Hang on, let me check. Because he just made a very subtle stance change, which is very effective for him. Just give me a sec. Yep. So initially, yep, okay. Let me just share the whole screen so that you can see. Okay, the whole desktop. Sorry, I'm in a mess. Just give me a sec. Okay, we need this. And how do I minimize this? Okay. So this is the two videos that we are seeing right now. Can see, right? I'm trying to minimize the rest of the video so that the slides so that y'all won't get confused. Nope, my mom is calling. Okay, all right. So you can see the two brownish videos over here. On the left side is a closer stance, and on the right side is a slightly wider stance. Okay. What you can see, right, is I'm trying to keep his torso lean the same, but what's happening is when he pulls at a closer stance, right, whatever you do, right, you will see a little bit more back flexion, and he always complains that his body will throw forward and drive, and he cannot really feel his quad drive. So he's using his straps and trying to pull all the way with his back to finish the lift. And you can see that the lockout is not complete as well. So when I change him into a wider stance, right, initially he doesn't believe that he can go into a wider stance. Then he watched the second video. And after the second video, right, he trusts that, oh, now I can use my focus now is my knees and my toes. And when I put more focus on my knees and my toes already, right, let me try widening up the stance a little bit. And this is the result of what's happening. You will see that actually his torso lean is a little bit better after he pulls the slack. Okay, he's more upright. His hip stays the same. And when he drives, right, he's driving with his legs first. How we know that he's driving with his legs first is we won't see that the body will lean forward that much. Of course, the weights doesn't do justice. This is a slightly lighter weights. But what he's experiencing, right, based on our feedback when we are doing the online coaching training thing is he does feel that he no longer needs to struggle so much, right, to hold his hip position like here, the left side video. He doesn't need to hold his hip. Think about holding this. He doesn't need to think about holding this hip height position and stopping his back from flexing. He just need to keep the stance widened out like that. So when you think about widening up the stance, right, keep your stance subtle. Hi, mom. No, we're not gonna pick up the call. But the idea is you try to go for very subtle change first. That's number one, rule number one. Number two is, right, your focus cannot go into the hip. Your focus continues at your knee and your foot. Okay? Then you will be able to feel that, hey, I actually can widen up my stance. I don't need any mobility drills. But if you talk about mobility drills, right, I do have one exercise that can help us feel your right positioning. It's called a sumo glute hold, which I can share with you on the next session. I can prepare it and then I can share with you on the next session. But do let me know, give me a feedback. You can drop me an email about how you feel about the slightly wider stance. If you have any questions to it, email me, and then we can all answer it together and let everybody knows how was the experience like when we do the next week's call. So I can continue to share with us some other videos and scenarios of the sumo deadlift and the changes. Now this is the best example. Okay, so let me share the desktop again. So I want to share with you Surly. Let me put the screen bigger. Okay. So Surly is a client of mine who has who can't seem to hold her spine into position. So she bias herself into a more flexion position, which is nothing wrong. Because for me, right, the idea is if I try to train you to have a very, very strong TL junction, right, it's gonna take a very long time. She's gonna get very impatient and she's gonna leave me very soon. So nope, we don't do that. But what we do, right, is we capitalize on what you are best at. Okay, you are good at flexing, and as long as we are able to hold this flexion during the pull, we are good. Okay, so this is the video where she says she feel like shit lah. So this is a slightly closer stance. So what happens is when she start the pull, right, her torso lean is a lot more, and when she widen up the stance over here, you can see that her torso lean is a little bit different. It's much more upright. Even though she still portray the same behavior, which is a little bit of a flexion, and of course the angle is a little bit different, but you can see that the forward lean is less. So when she is a little bit more upright with a slightly wider stance, you can see that her knee angle, her femur angle does not change one. It's the same. So when that changes, she becomes more upright. And we, just because of that slight upright position, right, we got her away from flexing her back even more. Because when you have a very flexed back when you start the pull, right, the most challenging part about a pull, right, is making sure that the bar doesn't roll away from your body. Of course, this weight is very light, so she cannot really feel that the bar is rolling away from the body. But if you look at this one, right, this is 135. The bar stays in position. It doesn't roll backwards too much. Of course, the lift needs to be a little bit more cleaned up, but her torso lean, because of the less torso lean, right, it creates less room for error for her. So now, right, she's able to pull the weight a little bit more efficiently, and she no longer complains to me that, wow, my back cannot take it, this and that, this and that. Okay? Next. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm more like preaching why you should go wider stance. But anyway, let's continue. I have one more. This is Kenneth. I think he's in the call as well. So Kenneth has been receiving pretty positive feedback about the changes in his engagement. His stance stays the same. So this video is more about telling you, right? When you hold a wider stance, right, it doesn't mean that your body will be super upright. And you don't have to bring your knees and crank your knees out all the way one. So this is his most recent video of his deadlift. You can see that he's in a stance where it's optimal because the knee are buckled in a little bit, and then you can feel he's literally pulling in the most upright position that he can really. Of course, his leverages is very good. He has a very long arms. He's a U59 lifter. By the way, he can bench 120, so it doesn't mean that long arms means cannot bench. But so this is a ideal position for him. Slightly wider stance, somewhere in the mid-range. Not the wider stance as wide as mine, no, but he's able to feel himself driving into the floor. His knees does not change. He used to be, if I'm not wrong, even closer stance, which we slowly transited him into a much more slightly wider stance. So this is his today's video lah. This is perfect because right, he's telling me that today I feel the best. Because today, right, he's able to set himself into a most ideal position. The way the moment he drives off the floor, right, the knee never even buckle. So when the knee don't buckle, right, see, the knee minimally, you will know that the lift is very good already. So this is 210 for him lah. Okay. So let me see if I got any video which I plan to share today. Yep. All right. So this is more of a conventional deadlift. This is for who? Jordan, who is new to the call. He wants me to look at his conventional deadlift a little bit more. But actually there's some relation to what we can learn from here lah. So we also know that Randy is someone, if you can see, he adopts a very, very close stance. He tries to relax his arms, which is pretty okay. All right, and he wants to put on his belt and stack. So now, right, this is the position that he sets himself in. Because of the close stance, right, the only way for him to lock his hip into position, right, is through the adductors. So the adductors is like your inside muscle over here lah, in your crouch area. So his best strategy for him to hold tension on the legs, right, and the hip, right, is by putting his knees very, very close to each other. So that engages his adductors to hold his hips a little bit better. But our hips, right, can be held with many other different things. It should be a combination of the adductors, the glute medius, and a little bit of the erectors. But because of this stance that he's adopting, right, the only way he can hold the hips into a locked position is to tense up the adductors, which is why you have to compensate and give way for the lower back to let go so that you can manage a pull like this. But if I'm able to share with you what's going on, right, is you should start learning to open the stance a little bit wider to manage the lumbar spine. Because how it works is like this. I want to try and see myself. Okay, so let me stop share first. So how it works is like this. In how the hip behaves, right, is like this. When I open up my stance, okay, and squat down, right, in the best case scenario where my spine is neutral, I would engage my glute medius, which is here. I would engage my adductors to hold tension around my hips area. Okay? Even though you are slightly biasing flexion, this should also be the stance where you should be lah. So the wider stance engages the adductors and the glute medius. Some bit of flexion is all right, but you have to feel the glute medius and the adductors. If your stance get too close, you go into position, you get a lot of engagement on the core, okay? But you can only get engagement from the adductors, but you cannot get engagement from the glute medius. Which is why during the pull, as you come up, then you start to acquire the glute medius, which is why you can see that during the lockout, you also see that you are like slightly lean forward and you cannot lock your shoulders into position. So first you should think about setting a wider stance, and when you squat into position, you want to feel your glute your glute med, like spreading the eccentric behavior, and also the adductors. Then you can feel your legs, your hips getting locked in. You brace your core, then you stand the weight up. So that's a little bit more about conventional, which we didn't really dive into yet. But perhaps in the future, we'll go into that. I have very strong conventional lifters that we are pulling. But today, right, I feel that if you want to make adjustments, we shouldn't care so much about your back flexion. We should care a little bit more about getting that glute medius engagement. My mom is calling again. Okay, so anyway, it's 9 p.m. Likewise, I appreciate you guys for coming into the call. Today we have quite a not very complex, but I give you all the scenarios that we can experience if we change the stance of it. And that will conclude today's video webinar. Of course, if you feel that these webinars are very interesting and effective, do share with your friends so that they can have the opportunity to, have all these knowledges in their hand as well. And once again, if you want to repeat watching it, you can go into the Dropbox. And usually I will do it, I'll upload it when I'm free lah. Oh yeah, and by the way, I go and check Dropbox, right? If I want to buy more storages, it's much more expensive than Google Drive. So once again, I'm very sorry. I might need to move us into Google Drive in future. But anyway, I'm glad that you will be able to learn something today and explore a little bit more on your next adventure to Sumo Deadlift. And I will see you on next week. Bye bye. No problem. Bye bye. No problem. Bye bye. Yeah, man. Need to call mom. Okay, okay. See you. Bye bye.